Child brides and power plays in medieval society. Marriage was a tool for power. It was not for love or youth. It was for strategy and alliances, often arranged when children were small. A girl could be betrothed at 6 or 7, a boy at the same age. Their lives were planned before they could walk or talk. These early arrangements served political aims. They secured alliances between families. They prevented warfare. They increased landholdings and influence. They created powerful clans. They shaped borders and loyalties. For noble families, this meant power at the bargaining table. They negotiated across kingdoms. They betrothed their children to secure alliances. They promised marriage to unite rival clans. They used their children to protect their realm. For example, Margaret Beaufort was betrothed at age 6. Her marriage secured her son Henry Tudor's claim to the throne. Her childhood and future were shaped by political need. Child brides had no choice. They did not understand the contract. They could not consent. They entered marriage as tools of diplomacy. They carried the weight of dynasties on small shoulders. The age of actual marriage could be delayed. Betrothal was binding. Full marriage might not happen until puberty. Despite this, the contract held power. The girl remained promised. Her betrothed remained her future husband. At puberty, marriage could be consummated. This was considered legal. It meant the girl left her home. She moved to her husband's household. She moved into a foreign world filled with rules. She became a wife before she was a woman. The power dynamic was clear. A child in an adult world. She had no authority. She followed orders. She served her husband. Sometimes she served lords and priests too. Consent was a strange concept. She was told to obey. She had no real say. Her feelings were irrelevant. Her body was part of a contract. Her duty eclipsed everything else. Feudal power worked through these unions. It created strong alliances. It brought together families. It secured loyalty. It produced heirs and secured inheritance. It prevented claims on land. It protected interests. Sometimes the girl maintained her position. She became powerful later. She ruled as queen or regent. Her marriage gave her influence and power. Her name was remembered in history for authority and intelligence. But mostly, she was forgotten. Her identity erased. She was known as someone's wife. She had no voice. She was never free. She remained silent. Child marriage also reinforced class barriers. Rich families locked their daughters into elitist alliances. Poor families had fewer options. They often married into other poor families. They remained rooted in the same social class. Marriage bound people in place. Early marriage also meant early pregnancy. A girl might bear a child at 12 or 13. Her body still growing, her health at risk. Many died in childbirth. Many lost babies. Many never recovered. Childbirth was brutal. There were no hospitals, no doctors, no sterile tools, no anesthesia. Women risked infection or bleeding. They risked death every time they carried a child. When a child bride gave birth, her labor was watched by family and midwife. They used herbs and prayers. They prayed for safety. They feared complications. But mostly, they feared silence and fear. Some girls died in childbirth. They never experienced life beyond the marriage. They never knew freedom. They died as martyrs. For alliance and lineage, their tombs reminded families of the cost. Early marriage also meant limited education. Many girls had no schooling. The only lesson was obedience. They learned household tasks and religious duties. They developed no voice. Their education often stopped at reading prayers. They learned to read little or not at all. They learned to spin, weave, cook, and clean. They learned to care for children. They were shaped into a role, not a person. For boys, marriage was also binding. They inherited authority. They managed land and livestock. They gained economic power. They entered politics. They fought in wars. They signed treaties. They bore the burden of lineage. Boys also lost youth. They left play for tasks. They were trained to rule. They were schooled in war. They were groomed for power. Some boys flourished. They became knights. They commanded armies. They built castles. But most became lords, with debts and no true estate. They carried more than they could afford. The system depended on child marriage. It created stability. It secured loyalty. It shaped kingdoms. It engineered succession. It also caused pain. It caused fear. It caused loss. And it denied childhood. It denied innocence. It denied love. In some regions, laws evolved. They raised the legal age of marriage. They required consent. They protected innocence. But those reforms came slowly. They came centuries later. In the meantime, young girls bound themselves in silence. They obeyed. They endured. They survived. Some child brides slipped through the system. They became wise women. They used their position to help others. They intervened to save children or families. They became midwives or healers. They gained influence quietly. Others rebelled. They refused to consummate. They fled. They joined convents. They broke the contract. Only some succeeded. Many failed. They died in disgrace or isolation. Child brides showed the power of human will. They showed the hunger for survival. They showed compassion in harsh worlds. They showed loyalty and betrayal. They showed the cost of contract and ambition. Their stories appear in chronicles. They hide between political records. Their voices emerge in letters and convent archives. They whisper of fear and courage. Some voices survived. Margaret Beaufort, Isabel of Bavaria, Eleanor of Aquitaine. They spoke after marriage. They wielded power through diplomacy. They shaped history. They transformed brutality into influence. Most remained silent. Histories forgot them. But their lives shaped the structure of medieval society. Their marriages shaped borders and bloodlines. We remember their cost, not glory, their sacrifice, not celebration, their lost childhood, not the union. Child marriage was a weapon. It built kingdoms. It bound people to power. It shaped destinies. It shaped nations. It was brutal. It was necessary. It left scars. It left legacies. As we learn their stories, we honor their voices. We see that history is not only about kings and battles. It is about children in contracts. It is about the price of power. In medieval history, some of the darkest ideas come not from war or famine, but from marriage. One of the most disturbing stories is the legend of the first night, also known by its Latin name, Jus Primae Noctis. This phrase means the right of the first night. It refers to a custom where a feudal lord could sleep with a serf's bride before her husband could. The image is brutal. A young bride on her wedding night, her husband waiting, the lord appearing, a night stolen in the name of power. It sounds monstrous. It sounds real. But was it? This chapter separates myth from fact. It explores what feudal lords really did, what rights they truly had, and why the legend of Jus Primae Noctis still haunts our understanding of medieval life. Let us begin with the myth. Many stories and films show lords taking this right. The wedding is interrupted. The guards drag the bride away. The villagers bow in silence. It appears as a common fear. It creates a dark tone for medieval life. But historical records tell a different story. There is almost no legal evidence that this right existed in formal law. No clear medieval documents list Jus Primae Noctis as a written law. No court cases defend it. No legal contracts include it as a rule. It appears in stories, in satire, in political attacks written centuries later. The myth grew in later centuries. During times of revolution, writers used it to paint nobles as monsters, as beasts of cruelty and lust, as reasons to overthrow the elite. It became a weapon of literature, not a rule of law. So if it was a myth, why did people believe it? Why does it feel so possible? Because the Lord still had power. Even without the formal right, he owned the land. He could punish peasants. He could demand fines. He could demand favors. He could take without asking, and many did. A feudal lord might not claim a bride's first night, but he could call her to work in the manor. He could call her to dance at his feast. He could flirt without fear of punishment. He could harass without anyone daring to speak. And sometimes he did worse. Women had little power. Peasant families had no voice. If a lord crossed the line, there was no court to run to, no guards to stop him, no justice to serve. This created an atmosphere of fear, and from that fear, the myth was born. Even if the law was not real, the threat felt real. The story grew, passed from village to village, from mother to daughter as a warning. In some regions, fines were required to marry, called murder. A peasant paid the lord a fee when his daughter married. This was not a claim to her body, but it reinforced power. It reminded peasants that nothing happened without permission, not even love. Sometimes lords abused this system. They increased the fee. They demanded labor instead of coin. They punished couples who married without approval. This made the marriage feel owned, controlled, almost invaded. Peasants hated the merchant. They saw it as a stain. They whispered rumors that it meant something worse. They created stories. They warned their daughters. The myth became more than fiction. It became fear given shape. In rare cases, nobles did force women, not just peasants, but even other noble women. They used power to silence, to conquer, to command. These acts were crimes, but rarely punished. The church sometimes intervened, but often stayed silent, because the noble class protected its own. So while Jus Primae Noctis was likely not real as a legal right, abuse of power was real. Fear was real. Silence was real. And trauma left scars even if laws did not record it. The myth persisted because it made sense to those who suffered. Because the structure of feudalism made the lord untouchable. Because the bride's body was never truly her own. It belonged to her family, then to her husband, and always under the shadow of her lord. Writers and reformers used the myth for purpose. French revolutionaries told the tale to stir anger. Playwrights and poets spread it to feed drama. Modern films revived it to show brutality. It became symbol more than truth. But symbols have power. Jus Primae Noctis lives in memory because it speaks to something deeper. The lack of consent, the fear of power, the helplessness of peasants, and the cruelty of unchecked authority. Today, historians challenge the myth. They ask for evidence. They study law codes. They search archives. They remind us that truth must be based in record, but the myth is still told, because the fear was real, the pain was real, the silence was real, and the shadow still lingers. It is a legend born from power imbalance, from centuries of voices too small to be heard, from women who vanished into contracts, and nights that were never truly theirs. So we say again, Jus Primae Noctis may not have existed in law, but in the minds of peasants, it was always there, because sometimes what is believed shapes more than what is true. The public bedding ceremony marriage in medieval Europe did not end with the vows. It ended with the bed. Or more accurately, it began there, for noble couples, and sometimes even among the wealthier common folk. A ritual called the bedding ceremony followed the wedding feast. It was not about privacy, it was about proof. This ceremony marked the moment of consummation, the first act of intimacy, and it was not done alone. The idea was simple. The community had witnessed the vows. Now they must witness the fulfillment. Marriage was not sealed until it was sealed physically. This was not just gossip. It was legal, it was spiritual, and it was public. Guests would escort the couple to the bridal chamber. They carried torches or candles. They sang, they made crude jokes. They teased and laughed and clapped. In some places, they stripped the couple down to their undergarments. In others, they laid them in bed while fully dressed. Either way, they placed them beneath the covers, in full view of family, of friends, of churchmen, of servants. Some would throw shoes at the bed. Others poured wine. Some held up the bed curtain. Some watched with approval. The act itself was not always witnessed directly, but everything around it was. In some traditions, especially in Northern Europe, a priest would bless the bed. Holy water sprinkled across the sheets, a sign of divine oversight, as if God himself watched from the shadows. The witnesses would leave, eventually. The couple was expected to do what they had to do, often exhausted, often strangers, often terrified, in noble houses. A servant might remain just outside, waiting to see how long it took, or waiting to inspect the results. The next morning, proof was required in many households. The sheets were checked for blood, evidence that the bride had been a virgin. If blood was found, it was celebrated, sometimes paraded, sometimes shown to guests. It was proof that the marriage was valid. It meant honor. It meant fertility. It meant success. If there was no blood, there was trouble. Whispers, questions, accusations, sometimes annulment. This practice was not about sex. It was about control. The community controlled the marriage. The church controlled the bedroom. The law controlled the body. A bride's virginity was not a personal matter. It was property. It was honor. It was currency. A family's future rested on what happened in that bed. Peasant households had simpler versions. There were no fine linens, no torches. But even in a poor cottage, the village watched. They waited for signs. They asked. They listened. Gossip spread quickly. If a couple did not sleep together, the wedding was not real. Children born might be called illegitimate. The marriage could be questioned. Property could be lost. Among nobles, especially those with lands and titles, the bedding ceremony was political. It was the final stamp, the moment when all the promises became real. Some monarchs required witnesses to sign a document, swearing they had seen the couple enter the bed and heard them confirm the act. In rare cases, if the couple could not or would not consummate, a marriage could be annulled. This meant loss of land, loss of dowry, loss of face. Many young brides feared this moment. They were barely women. Some were 13, some younger. Their husbands were often much older. The bed was not a place of love. It was a battlefield of expectations. Servants prepared the bed. Rose petals, perfumed pillows, heavy curtains. None of it softened the pressure. The bride had been raised to obey, to be silent, to be still. The act was expected, whether she understood it or not. Some brides were coached by mothers, by midwives, by ladies in waiting, told to lie flat, told to not cry, told to survive. The groom, equally nervous at times, faced judgment too. If he failed to perform, he faced shame, laughter, even accusations of weakness or curses. In this moment, the body became a test of masculinity, a test of purity, a test of obedience. Over time, the ritual changed. By the late medieval period, some couples began to ask for privacy. Some bedding ceremonies became symbolic. A toast, a song, a locking of the door. But the expectation remained that someone would know, that someone would confirm. The bedding ceremony tells us something deep, that marriage in this era was never private, it was public, it was enforced, it was a ritual of surveillance, of proof, of pressure. For modern minds, the idea is shocking, unthinkable. But in medieval Europe, it was normal, expected, even celebrated. And so, the wedding did not end with "I do." It ended with "we did." In the medieval world, purity was not just a virtue, it was a requirement, especially for women, especially for brides. A girl's virginity was her family's reputation. It was her father's pride, her mother's fear, her husband's entitlement. It was the boundary between honor and shame, between status and scandal, between a future and a ruined name. On the wedding night, everything came down to one thing: proof that the bride had never lain with a man, proof that the marriage was legitimate, proof that she had fulfilled her duty. That proof was measured in blood. When the couple retired to bed, there was no privacy, no sacred moment, only pressure. The room might be filled with witnesses, or they might be outside the door. The air was thick with expectation. The sheets were laid out, clean, white, waiting. The act itself was often confusing and painful, especially for young brides. Many had no idea what to expect. They had been told to submit, to lie still, to let it happen. And then, the inspection. The next morning, the sheets were shown, lifted. Before family, before servants, before guests in some places. If there was blood, there was celebration. The bride was praised. The marriage was valid. The union was real. But if there was no blood, everything changed. Whispers began. Was she not pure? Had she known another man? Was she cursed? Was she even a woman at all? The husband might be humiliated. His family might demand answers. The bride could be sent away. The marriage annulled. The dowry reclaimed. The shame permanent sometimes. There was blood, but not from the act. Some brides pricked themselves, used small knives, used animal blood, anything to escape the wrath of their families. Midwives sometimes helped. Older women who understood, they coached the bride. They prepared the sheets. They protected her when they could. But even that was dangerous. If the trick was discovered, it meant ruin for the bride, for the midwife, for the entire household. The church supported the obsession with purity. Virginity was tied to holiness. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was the ideal. Every girl was expected to follow her path, at least until her wedding day. The law followed the church in many places. A man could annul a marriage if he believed his bride was not a virgin. No evidence was needed beyond his word. He could walk away, and she could not remarry in noble families. Virginity was political. It was part of treaty negotiations. If a bride was accused of impurity, the alliance could crumble, wars could start, DOWRIES could vanish. Her family's name could fall in a single night. The obsession ran deep, deeper than reason, deeper than compassion. Because purity was never about the girl, it was about the control of women, the control of lineage, the control of power. For peasant families, the stakes were still high. A lost reputation could mean no marriage. No marriage meant no land, no protection, no survival. So girls were guarded, closely, strictly, sometimes violently. They were watched. They were kept from boys, from men, from even speaking to strangers, and still, rumors spread. One look at the wrong man, one laugh at the wrong moment, one walk through the village alone, that was enough to spark suspicion, and suspicion, once started, was almost impossible to erase. Some girls were punished before they ever married, flogged, locked away, cast out. All without proof, only whispers. It was not just a fear, it was a system, and it worked. Because everyone believed in it. Mothers, fathers, husbands, priests, even the brides themselves. They believed they had failed. If there was no blood, they believed they were broken. They believed they were dirty. They believed they deserved. What came next? That belief crushed generations. It erased stories, it buried voices, and it turned wedding nights into trials, into interrogations, into judgments. But there were those who pushed back. Some families ignored the missing blood. Some grooms protected their wives. Some midwives lied to save a girl's life. Over time, the obsession with physical proof began to fade, but never disappeared, because the myth of the blood, the power of the sheet, lasted longer than the people who lived under it. Even today, in some cultures, the same expectation remains. A girl must bleed, or she has failed. But in truth, purity was never about virtue. It was about property. It was about control. It was about telling a girl, your body is not yours. Your worth is in what we find on the linen, not in who you are. That is why this tradition matters, not because it was just, but because it shows what happens when dignity is measured in blood. In the medieval world, consent was not a requirement, not in marriage, not in love, not even in life decisions. Most women did not choose. Their husbands, most brides, were not asked. They were told who they would marry, told when, told why, and once married, consent ended. Completely, a wife belonged to her husband, in law, in church. In the eyes of society, she was not a partner. She was property. A father could marry off a daughter, without her voice, without her agreement, without her knowing the man at all. If she refused, she could be beaten, she could be starved, she could be cast out, she could be forced anyway, because obedience was expected, because silence was safer, because resistance meant ruin. Even in religious settings, consent was a shadow, a whisper. The church said both parties must agree, but who listened to the bride's words? Who listened to the child in the corner? who listened to the girl too afraid to speak. They signed the paper, they stood before the priest, and the world called it a yes. In reality, it was survival. Once married, a woman had no legal power to refuse her husband. If he wanted her, she had to submit. If she said no, it did not matter. The law said her husband had rights, rights to her body, rights to her labor, rights to her obedience. It was called the marital debt. The wife owed it. Like rent, like taxes, it was not optional. There was no word for marital rape, because it did not exist in their law. Because the man could not violate what he already owned. He was entitled. Always. Even if she was sick, even if she cried, even if she bled, she had to fulfill the role. This belief came from many places, from Roman law, from feudal codes, from church teachings, from centuries of silence. A good wife was obedient. She was modest. She did not complain. She did not resist. Mothers taught daughters not how to love, but how to endure, how to stay quiet, how to keep the peace, how to make themselves small. In noble homes, consent was theater. The girl stood at the altar, in silk, in gold, surrounded by witnesses. She nodded, she bowed, she repeated the words. But her life was already spoken for. In peasant villages, there was even less ceremony. A bride moved from one hut to another. She changed clothes. She started working. She bore children. There were no questions, only expectations. There were rare exceptions. Some women said no, some resisted, some ran, some chose the convent. A rare escape, but even that required luck, permission, support, money. Most had none of those. Some women fought from within. They refused. The bed, they fled during the night. They begged for annulment, but very few won, because the structure was not built for consent. It was built for control. Consent was never needed from women, only from fathers, from lords, from the church. And if the husband was cruel, if he beat her, if he starved her, she still could not leave. Marriage was binding, no escape, no voice, no law to help her. In some places, she could be returned to her father, but only if the husband allowed it, only if he agreed, only if he no longer wanted her. That was not protection, that was exile. There are stories of women punished for speaking, for saying no, for defending themselves. They were called wicked. They were accused of disobedience, of rebellion, and yet some fought anyway. Their stories survived in letters, in court records, in whispers passed down. Not all of them lost. Some stood before bishops, told the truth, held their ground, but those were few, the exception, not the rule. The rule was silence. That is why this chapter matters, because when people speak of medieval marriage, they speak of tradition, of culture, of sacred vows. But behind those words were women who never said yes, women who were never given the chance. And until we say that plainly, their stories stay buried. Consent was not asked, it was not respected, it was not part of the union. And that truth should never be forgotten. Marriage in the medieval world was not a private moment. It was a public act, a social agreement, a visible event that required witnesses and signs so people would know, so no one could deny it, so the bond would hold. Unlike today's ceremonies with flowers and vows spoken in privacy, medieval weddings were legal events, social contracts, religious rituals, and everyone needed to see it happen. The most important part was not the kiss, it was the presence of witnesses. Church law required at least two. Local custom often demanded more. The more witnesses, the better, because they would remember what was said, who was present, who gave what, who owed what. If someone later claimed the marriage never happened, the witnesses would speak, they would testify, and the truth would be restored. These weren't just passive observers. They were often close relatives, village elders, guildmasters, local priests, men and women with authority. They heard the vows spoken, they saw the couple touch hands. Sometimes they escorted the couple to the bed. Sometimes they stayed through the night without witnesses. The marriage could be questioned. The children could be called illegitimate. The land could be contested. The dowry could be reclaimed. So the witness role mattered. They were not just guests. They were guardians of the bond. The next important sign was the ring, but not every marriage had one. Rings were more common among the wealthy. Gold or silver, sometimes carved with names or holy symbols. In poorer families, a ring might be made of iron. Or not given at all. Sometimes the token was a belt, a knife, a cloth. What mattered was the giving. Marriage in the medieval world was not a private moment. It was a public act, a social agreement, a visible event that required witnesses and signs, so people would know, so no one could deny it. So the bond would hold, unlike today's ceremonies with flowers and vows spoken in privacy. Medieval weddings were legal events, social contracts, religious rituals, and everyone needed to see it happen. The most important part was not the kiss. It was the presence of witnesses. Church law required at least 2. Local custom often demanded more. The more witnesses, the better, because they would remember what was said, who was present, who gave what, who owed what. If someone later claimed the marriage never happened, the witnesses would speak, they would testify, and the truth would be restored. These weren't just passive observers. They were often close relatives, village elders, guild masters, local priests, men and women with authority. They heard the vows spoken. They saw the couple touch hands. Sometimes they escorted the couple to the bed. Sometimes they stayed through the night. Without witnesses, the marriage could be questioned. The children could be called illegitimate. The land could be contested. The dowry could be reclaimed. So the witness role mattered. They were not just guests. They were guardians of the bond. The next important sign was the ring. But not every marriage had one. Rings were more common among the wealthy. Gold or silver, sometimes carved with names or holy symbols. In poorer families, a ring might be made of iron or not given at all. Sometimes the token was a belt, a knife, a cloth. What mattered was the giving. The moment the groom placed something in the bride's hand, something with meaning, to mark the bond, to show intention. The ring, if there was one, carried weight. It was a sign of trust, of permanence, of a circle that could not be broken. If a ring was given in front of witnesses, the marriage was considered sealed. The law recognized it. The church blessed it. The community accepted it. But even before the church controlled marriage, there was another tradition. Handfasting. Handfasting was old, pagan in root, common in many villages, especially in Celtic and Norse cultures. In handfasting, the couple held hands, often right hand to right hand. Their hands were bound with a cord or ribbon, sometimes by a priest, sometimes by an elder, sometimes by a friend. It was simple, it was powerful, it was direct. Hand fasting could be temporary, a trial marriage, a one-year commitment. If the couple stayed together after that, it became permanent. Some hand fastings were lifetime vows from the start. It depended on region, on belief, on agreement. The church disliked hand fasting. It was too informal, too pagan, too uncontrolled. But for centuries, it remained popular because it was accessible, because it was local, because people believed in it. By the 12th century, the church worked to standardize marriage. They wanted everything done before an altar, with a priest present, with official prayers, with holy water and blessing. But even then, hand fasting lingered. It was done in kitchens, in fields, at village fairs, quietly, powerfully. What made a marriage real? It was not just the priest, it was the public word, the shared promise, the visible sign. Whether it was a gold ring, a rough cord, or just a clasp of hands in the sight of others, the vow was what mattered. Because marriage was not just for the couple, it was for the community. It tied families, it joined property, it shaped futures. And without proof, without something visible, it could all fall apart. So they made sure people saw, made sure people remembered, made sure the vows left a mark. Marriage needed to be known, to be recorded in hearts and eyes, because memory was law, and tradition was stronger than paper. That is why hand fasting mattered. That is why rings mattered. That is why witnesses were everything. Because, in the medieval world, a wedding without proof was not a wedding at all. Consummation or coercion, the vows were said. The witnesses had watched. The food was eaten. The bride was dressed. The fire had burned down low. Now came the part no one liked to talk about, but everyone expected it. The wedding was not finished until the marriage was consummated. That meant sex. That meant proof. That meant pressure. For the man, it was duty. For the woman, it was destiny. For both, it was law. But what happens when duty becomes demand? When destiny becomes fear? When the law does not ask permission, it simply takes. In the medieval world, consummation was not about passion. It was about validation. Without it, the marriage was not legally binding. Without it, the marriage could be undone. Without it, the wife could be cast aside. That is why it was forced. Not always with violence, but always with weight. The weight of expectations, the weight of survival, the weight of the world. A husband had the right. A wife had the obligation. That was the unspoken truth. That was the system. Consent was not required. Desire was not considered. Readiness was not questioned. Many brides were girls, barely 13, some even younger. Their bodies were still growing. Their minds were still forming. But their marriages were real. Their wedding nights were required. Some were terrified. Some were in pain. Some bled for days. Some never healed. And some died. The husband was expected to perform. If he could not, it was shameful. If he refused, it was failure. If he waited, it was weakness. So even gentlemen were pushed. The pressure came from all sides, from family, from the church, from custom. There were even tests, questions, inspections, observations. The next morning, the couple was expected to appear, dressed, smiling, saying yes, it happened. Sometimes blood on the sheets was shown. Sometimes the guests laughed and clapped. Sometimes the father of the bride poured a drink in honor. All of it was a mask, covering silence, covering shame, covering trauma. Not all women suffered. Some grew to love their husbands. Some found strength in the new life. Some were treated kindly, but many were not. Many felt no control, no ownership of their bodies, no way to say no. And if they did say no, the marriage could be questioned. The dowry could be lost. The family could be punished. The church taught that sex within marriage was holy, a duty to create life, a way to bond. But the church also said a woman must obey. She could not refuse. She could not leave. She could not fight back, even if she cried, even if she bled, even if she screamed. In many villages, brides were prepared for pain, told to endure, told it would pass, told it was right. No one spoke of pleasure. No one asked if she wanted it. No one thought that mattered. And for the husband, the pressure was different but just as real. He had to perform. He had to prove his manhood. He had to make an heir. If he failed, his honor was questioned. If he hesitated, his strength was doubted, so he acted, even if he was afraid, even if he was unsure, even if the girl beside him was sobbing. Some men waited. Some chose kindness. Some found a way to make it better. But the world around them did not care. It only cared that it was done, that the bond was sealed, that the law was satisfied, because, in the medieval world, a wedding without consummation was no wedding at all. So the question was never, did she want it? It was always, did they do it? And that is why we must call it what it was. Not always a union, often a violation. Not always love, sometimes coercion. And yet it was accepted, encouraged, expected, because the system was not built for choice. It was built for survival. And that survival came at a terrible cost.